Hey, so today we're going to go through A Knight's Tale. And unlike the previous episodes of this particular series, I'm going to go through the character archetypes and how they work through the story, rather than the stages of the hero's journey, which I've done a few times already. Now, this movie has really clear, well-defined archetypes that don't really shift too much between characters, which I think will make it easier for me to explain how they work. We all love a hero, and we do because they want to change the world for themselves and for the better. In Will's case, we also happen to just agree with him. Why can't anyone compete in the games if they're good enough? Now, Will takes risks and he bucks convention, and we respect him for taking the more perilous path in life, rather than the safer options that are presented to him at every point in the story. From doing the joust in the first place, deciding to focus on jousting when he's better at the sword fighting. And there is a key conflict between his desire to become a champion and his flaw that he isn't a nobleman. And it's those two things that create conflict, which is what the whole movie is built around. The Herald is both the dead knight, and eventually Jeff takes on some of the responsibilities of the Herald. Now, their thing is to spike the hero's curiosity in the special world, and sometimes to help them across the threshold itself.
Inherited the fief of Lumba from...
do, Herald.
And the dead knight does the first thing, and Jeff does the second thing. Now, the knight who's dead at the start of the movie is the one who gives young Will the opportunity to joust for the first time. And it's only after he's won that Will becomes relentless about being a somebody and winning tournaments. But it turns out that Will needs help in the form of the naked Jeff Chaucer in order to actually cross the threshold. He needs patents of nobility. He needs that item to get him across the threshold, so he can at least pretend to be noble and compete. Jeff doesn't make it easy, but he does eventually help him and is the one who gets Will across the threshold, fulfilling the duties of the Herald. I mean, here is also just a good example of how you can see two different characters be the same archetype at two different points in the story. From the outset, it's Roland and Watt, with Jeff, Kate, and Jocelyn all becoming allies later in the film. Now, an ally's defining trait is that they really have a blind faith and support for the hero. And Roland and Watt do this relentlessly, even after explaining all of the reasons why Will's plan won't work at the start of the movie. They choose to help Will anyway. And what they do goes against all of the logic of the world that they live in. They help him learn how to dance so that he can be a convincing member of the nobility at a feast that night. And with Watt in particular emasculating himself in order to help. In a later tournament, they bet everything they have on Will to win, against crazy odds. Such is the faith that they have in him. And even late in the film, when the full weight of the English monarchy is set against him, and they beg him to run and save his own skin, Will refuses, and they stick by him anyway. In all of these moments, Will could have buckled to self-doubt, but his allies supported him and helped him on his journey. So there's a brief moment at the beginning of the movie where Jeff is a shapeshifter. And while he's negotiating a deal to forge Will's patents of nobility, he also realizes that he can use this situation to his advantage. And the reason he's naked, unbeknownst to Will, is that he has a gambling debt that he needs to pay. And if he can attach himself to Will, this fake noble, then he can fob his debt off on him. This is a shapeshifter moment because he helps Will out with the intention of doing the complete opposite at the first opportunity, without Will knowing what's going on. And because Will is our hero and such a nice guy, he helps Jeff out with his debt and turns Jeff from a shapeshifter into an ally. There are three main ones in this story. There's Kate, Jocelyn, and Prince Edward. Now, their job as Threshold Guardians are to be obstacles to be overcome or monsters to be slain, so that the hero can discover something or learn something new. And all three of these I would describe as obstacles that Will overcomes rather than monsters that he slays. So the first one is Kate, who's the blacksmith that when Will first meets her, he essentially lies to her to trick her into fixing his armor. And he comes across very egotistical, and only once he seems to get over this false egotistical act that he's had to put on in order to be convincingly noble, that she agrees to help him. Both in terms of learning how to dance, as well as making him some fancy personalized armor. And what Will learns in going through this process with her is that he doesn't have to change his personality in order to be taken seriously or to be considered a nobleman. The second is Jocelyn, who's a little more complicated. She is Will's love interest, and she just wants to be treated as an equal by her partner. Again, something that is bucking the usual rules of the ordinary world. And it's that wanting to be treated equally that is her driving motivation behind what she does and all the tests that she puts Will through. The first test being that Will wants to just know her name, and she won't tell him because she wants him to prove that he doesn't just see her as a prize to be won. The lesson being that his motivation for his desires need to be morally good. Now, unbeknownst to him, he's the only knight in that first tournament where they first meet not to pledge to win the tournament for her, setting him apart from the rest. And at the banquet that night, he shows humility and is honest with his feelings about her. He's passed the first test, and all of a sudden it's game on between them. Now, the second test is where she asks him about what he's going to wear at a banquet so that she can match him. And because he's in a mood because of the way the tournament went down, he ridicules her as only caring about silly things like dresses and banquets. She says it's better to care about that than horses and sticks. And then she stops going to tournaments. The lesson for Will being that if he wants to be with her, he needs to show that he cares about her. And he, with the help of his growing group of allies at this point, write a love letter to win her back. Now that doesn't work outright, but it does buy him the opportunity to speak to her. And so the second time around, he has this inability to be romantic in the same way, and is less impressive. Because of that, he needs to find another way to prove himself, and so she asks him to just lose at the next tournament, just to lose every round. The lesson being that if he loves her, that he'll love her more than he loves himself. And for him to prove that, he has to give up his own needs in order to show her that she is worth it. He initially says no because the idea is just so abhorrent to what he wants to achieve. But when it comes to the crunch, he does what she asks and he takes a beating. So much so that he has a dislocated shoulder from taking so many hits. At that point, he's proven himself to her. And so she switches it and she tells him to win, which is what he wants to do anyway. And that's her just saying, "You've proved yourself, I'm on Team Will now." Ultimately, with Jocelyn, the lesson for Will is that if you're honest and you put people ahead of yourself, you end up receiving way more than you give. Last but not least, you got Prince Edward. And when Will and Prince Edward first meet, Will doesn't know that he's a prince. And while they're jousting, Prince Edward gets injured. And he asks Will if he can just concede at the end, and that if he can keep his honor by finishing the bout. And Will agrees to that and follows through on it. So Prince Edward presents his first opportunity to show mercy, and he does. And this pays off later in the movie. The second time they meet, it's sort of the opposite. This time everyone knows that it's Prince Edward, and no one will joust with him because they don't want to injure a member of the monarchy. Except Will. And this is Prince Edward presenting Will's first opportunity to show that he can take on any challenge, which ultimately wins the respect of the prince. And it also shows that Will is taking on the power structure of the society literally as well as figuratively by jousting. And it's because he's passed these tests that prove his mettle that the prince then later on gives him the gift of turning him into a bona fide knight of the realm, which allows him to compete in the final tournament at the World Championships and complete his journey. Now, once Will has learned all of these different lessons from the Threshold Guardians, all of them end up being allies from that point on in the story. Which isn't always the case with Threshold Guardians, but definitely is in this story. Our shadow being Count Adhemar. Now, their main quality is to be the most dangerous obstacle for the hero to overcome, and Adhemar proves through this story that he is incredibly dangerous. He also just happens to be the polar opposite of Will on every level. He's already a champion jouster and a nobleman with money, fame, and even an army. Now, where they are similar is that they both want prestige and to be the best jouster, which is the thing that puts them at odds with one another. But how they go about becoming that is very, very different. And they go to war with each other through the story on two fronts. In the arena, jousting, and in trying to win Jocelyn's hand in marriage, I suppose. In terms of the joust, the first time they meet, Adhemar beats Will. And he does so in a less than honourable way. And this is Adhemar's win at all costs attitude that stops Will from being the tournament champion. That's sort of the first blockade that he puts up. Now, the second blockade is when the jousters find out that Prince Edward is competing. Adhemar concedes immediately, which is the opposite of what Will ends up doing. But this frustrates Will, because he goes on to win the tournament, but it's a false win. He hasn't proven that he's the best yet, which coincides with when he ends up getting a bit pissy with Jocelyn about what to wear that night. And his frustration continues when Adhemar is called to war. Now, Will keeps winning tournaments, but he doesn't feel like a winner because he hasn't beaten Adhemar yet. But what it has done is bought Will the time to become the best jouster, even though he hasn't proven it yet. So, I'm going to get back to the jousting, but I've got to explain his approach to winning Jocelyn, and then it all kind of comes together at the end. So, I've already said how Will won Jocelyn's hand, but Adhemar's take is the complete opposite of that approach. Now, when they first meet, he tries to impress her with his accomplishments in the joust and on the battlefield, and he even puts Will down and calls him a peasant knight. He's always just trying to put himself on top. Now, this doesn't impress Jocelyn, but that doesn't stop him from doing it anyway. When Adhemar returns from war, he realizes that Will's had all this time to court Jocelyn, and so he just circumvents Jocelyn altogether by just negotiating with her father to buy her hand in marriage. Which is obviously the complete opposite tactic of what Will has done, and is also just the complete opposite of what Jocelyn wants. He could ruin both their lives just because he's rich. And he's totally willing to do that. Going back to the joust, when Adhemar returns for the World Championships, he's told that Will is unbeatable. Now, Adhemar can't have that, so he gets some dirt on Will and has him arrested. But because Will has turned all of his Threshold Guardians into allies, they end up having to face each other in the arena anyway. Now, again, Adhemar can't beat him fair and square, so he's tipped a lance to injure Will. It works, and Will can't really compete, to the point where he needs the lance lashed to his arm. Now, again, his allies help him buy time with that and help do the thing. But at this point, Will only has one way to win. To do what no one else has done before and knock Adamar off his horse. And for some reason he screams his own name while he does it, but it works, and that's him defeating the shadow, overcoming the shadow, and setting the world to rights. Okay, and that's it for the analysis of The Knight's Tale. If you have any comments or queries, comments below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. That really helps me out a lot. And I'll see you next week with another video. Peace!